So my talk today is titled Nature's Touch, Exploring How Soil Microbes Shape Skin and Microbiome Diversity. And if my buttons are going to work, come on, buttons. There we go. Beautiful. So I'm going to start just talking a little bit about what the skin microbiome actually is, because we hear a lot in the media about things like the gut microbiome, and just how much the gut microbiome can influence our broader health. This has been a really hot topic recently. I know the amazing Professor Felice Jacka was on, I think it was ABC, talking about fecal microbiome transplants and how that can really affect that gut-brain axis as well. So the skin microbiome is still a microbiome system, so along a very similar vein, but of course it influences a very different part of our body. So the skin microbiome and the field as a whole is still very much in its infancy. There have been a lot more studies that have come out recently, and I think the reason is because technology has become more accessible to actually measure the gut microbiome appropriately. But previously, because it's such a hostile environment, it's been really difficult to study. So I'm really happy to be talking about the skin microbiome a bit more, telling more people about how incredibly important it is to our overall health and well-being, as well. So on that note, the skin microbiome itself, similar to the gut, is all of the microbes that are on our skin. So that's the bacteria, the fungi, the viruses, everything that lives on our skin in a commensal state, that really helps our skin health, helps keep our skin regulated. It helps prime the immune system to respond to threats and foreign pathogens, and even things that it may only perceive as a threat. For example, pollen, if you've got hay fever or something like that. And the skin microbiome is quite unique in that it differs across every person. So there isn't necessarily a standard normal skin microbiome because it's influenced by so many things, from genetics to environment, to even where exactly within a particular environmental niche you live. And even different sites on your body can actually differ in microbiome, which is, I think, quite cool. And I wanted to just lead with a couple of cool facts. Well, facts that I think are cool. And if you share my nerdy love for the microbiome, hopefully you'll think they're cool as well. So the first one is if you take all of your external and internal microbiome, so gut, skin, etc., and you were to weigh them, that would weigh about 1.2 kilos, which the metric that the fact usually uses is that they're the same weight as a human brain. But what I like to think about is a little bit more tangible. It's about 3 tins of tomatoes. So it is substantial. And if it's that substantial, it has a critical impact on our health. And as I mentioned, the skin microbiome really differs from person to person, and it's as unique as a fingerprint. Everyone will be slightly different. Even twins living in the same household, they will still have a slightly different microbial signature. And the final thing I'll talk about for this fact, but I'll touch on a little bit later in the talk, is the development of the microbiome starts at birth. So whether that's the skin microbiome, the gut microbiome, or other elements of health, they're heavily influenced from the time you are born, and it can continue to change until adolescence and adulthood. But those first 4 to 5 years post-birth are really critical for being able to develop a healthy microbiome that leads to positive health attributes down the line. So why does the skin microbiome matter? I've touched on it a bit already, but our skin is the interface with the wider world. It's constantly interacting with our environment. It protects us from everything that's going on in the broader world, and it's constantly under threat. So if you think about if you commute to work, for example, you'll get up, you'll go about your daily routine. If you have a shower, you'll wash your skin, so you're being exposed to the soap and the water. If you catch the train, then you're in public transport with all sorts of different microbes. And then if you're walking to work in the city, you're exposed to UV radiation from the sunlight, you're exposed to pollution, and you're exposed to a totally different environment again once you get into the office. So our skin is constantly reading those signals, and our immune system is interpreting them and seeing how we should respond. So it's really important that we do keep a healthy skin microbiome so that we are able to combat all of these external stresses and not constantly break out in hives or things like that, because really our health is holistic. It can't be one single area. We have to keep our whole self healthy. And one of the cool things about the skin microbiome is it's able to do this, and it's able to remain relatively stable despite having a really limited amount of nutrients to survive on. So I like to usually compare the skin microbiome and the environment that those microbes live in to the gut microbiome and the microbes that live there. You're constantly feeding your gut with food and water. So your gut microbiome is exposed to many different sorts of nutrients it can feed on. But the skin is quite a hostile environment comparatively. So these microbes have actually adapted ways to live in the niches of our skin, which is also why different spots in our body harbor different microbiomes, because they've adapted these really intricate niches. And I also think it's quite interesting that even some of our skin microbiome are actually anaerobic species, which seems a bit counterintuitive because your skin is constantly exposed to the environment. But these species actually live a few micron deep and still have a really impactful outcome on what our skin barrier does and our skin integrity as well. And these microbes can do a lot of cool things. So one of them is some are able to produce antimicrobial peptides. So essentially have their own little antimicrobial action that they are able to produce themselves to stop pathogenic bacteria colonizing their particular niche. So our commensal species are protecting us in many different ways. That is one of them. And so if they see something nasty, so a Staphylococcus aureus, for example, that in combination with the immune system are able to pounce on that, outcompete it, and we are none the wiser. So it does impact on our health a lot, and I think it's really cool that we're now able to quantify that and recognize that. And it also assists with the way we're able to retain water, our skin hydration, because the microbiome produces metabolites that impact impact on what's called the tight junctions in the skin. So how close together your skin is. So if you've got, it's similar, leaky gut, leaky skin, water is not literally coming out of your skin, but you'll be a lot more prone to dry and flaky skin with a poor skin barrier. And some of these species that do really impact our skin health, despite there not being a standardized skin microbiome, some of the key players across the board are from Staphylococcus. So I mentioned Staph aureus as a pathogenic bacteria, but within the Staphylococcus family, there are about, I think, 50 different species of Staphylococcus. And one of those species is actually the most dominant species that inhabits our skin, which is Staphylococcus epidermidis. And this is actually one of the bacteria that specifically produce antimicrobial peptides against Staphylococcus aureus. And it's also able to produce several anti-inflammatory compounds that help regulate our inflammation when we come into contact with these things as well. We've also got Corynebacterium. So we find an anti-inflammatory effect with this one as well. And Corynebacterium also helps regulate those tight junctions that I mentioned. And then we've got Propionibacterium and Cutibacterium. So these are quite close genuses. So one of the other most common species that lives on the skin is a Cutibacterium, which was only recently reclassified to be Cutibacterium from the Propionibacterium genus. A little fun fact there. So that's Cutibacterium acnes. And this is, I think this one is really cool because one of the metabolites that Cutibacterium acnes can actually produce scavenges what we call free radicals. So they're essentially wild little oxygen species zooming around and damaging our DNA. And Cutibacterium, this ROXP binds to that to stabilize it so it's not causing DNA damage. So those free radicals are bound and it helps prevent that DNA damage, which is quite cool. And there's also some different therapeutic angles for some of these particular bacteria. But Cutibacterium acnes, for example, can also be an opportunistic pathogen. So it depends what part of the body that the bacteria is on. If it's on your face, which it's a very common bacteria that does occur on your face, you can get acne if it becomes overgrown. So it's a delicate balance, and the place that the microbe is on your skin is really important. And just to emphasize that point, there's a quote by one of the skin microbiome pioneers, Professor Elizabeth Grice, who says that the studies of topographical diversity across the human body sites, so for example, a moist area like your armpit versus a dry area like your forearm, are likely as ecologically dissimilar as a rainforests are to deserts. So it just really highlights how incredibly diverse our skin microbiome is, but how much it can differ between person to person and the individual themselves. So what would happen then if the skin microbiome were to change? Well, the skin microbiome can change for many reasons, whether that's you're changing environment, so you're moving from an urban setting to a rural setting, and you're exposed to more soil microbes, for example, or you start working in a hospital where you're constantly bombarded with different pathogens, and usually your body does a pretty good job of keeping everything normalized. But if we look at, for example, the condition atopic dermatitis or eczema, we have a bit of a circular feedback loop. So atopic dermatitis is a skin condition where you get that dry, flaky skin, extremely itchy, and it goes on cyclical flares. One of the driving features of these flares is microbial dysbiosis in your skin. But not only that, it's also microbial dysbiosis in your gut. So this talks about, and I'll go into it in a little bit more detail in a second, but the gut skin axis, which is really critical to maintain that communication between your gut and your skin, because it all feeds through on a circular loop. So when we have a look at atopic dermatitis, so for example, if someone with atopic dermatitis were to eat more ultra-processed foods, or I suppose a more Western diet, that's a pro-inflammatory type diet. And food, the nutrition is not my area of expertise, but we know that the ultra-processed food has an inflammatory effect. That inflammatory effect is systemic in the body, and it causes barrier disruption in the skin. Now, when that barrier is disrupted, those normal commensal species that are typically on your skin get disrupted. It's no longer a favorable environment for those particular species to be in. So that has the perfect opportunity for those pathogenic species to move in. They're able to colonize that environment, and then they can produce metabolites that will cause systemic inflammation, that will cause long-term barrier disruption issues. So it is really interconnected, but the skin microbiome is so incredibly important to protect and preserve, but also the gut microbiome, so that we're able to work together. They're able to work together to have an overall less inflammation in the body, therefore less diseases. But interestingly, diseases like eczema, like psoriasis, all of these inflammatory skin conditions, and also things like allergies have been on a real increase in the last few decades. And that is thought to be partially due to biodiversity loss. So we are exposed to a lot less general biodiversity on a very macro level, having a lot more urbanization, for example. We've got a lot more hygiene protocols, and all of these things are certainly important, particularly hygiene. But it does also lead to a reduction in the species on your skin, and just generally the species you're exposed to. And for those of you who listened to Dr. Jake Robinson's talk last night, this slide will be familiar to you as well, this particular figure. So the biodiversity hypothesis really talks about how a decline in biodiversity, so we see it all the time at a macro level. I'm based in Hobart, and we are seeing lots of logging. We're seeing populations decline, which is really sad on a macro level. But a similar thing can also be happening on a micro level, because the environments that these species need to thrive and to feed on are also diminishing. But not only that, if you're living in an urban environment, you just may not have the vicinity to something like a forest or as much green space. So your biodiversity is a lot more limited. And this then leads to what is more broadly called microbial deprivation, or what I would call microbial dysbiosis. So your skin microbiome isn't a typical microbiome. Despite there not being a normal, you've got less diversity. And the more diversity you typically have on your skin microbiome is great, because you don't have one particular species dominating, potentially being pathogenic and causing downstream effects. And that increase in diversity is also really good for your immune system. So if you've got less microbes, you are less primed to be able to respond to those pathogens, or what your body perceives as potential threats. And this then has a flow-on effect for increasing our risk of inflammatory diseases, such as eczema or psoriasis. So I spoke briefly about the gut-skin axis. Now, this is, I would say, still a field, particularly this axis, that is very much under investigation. So I'm really excited for the next couple of years to see where the science goes, and to really understand this link in a more intricate level. But at this point in time, what we see is twofold. So number one, we know that bacteria are able to translocate. Now, there have been studies previously where bacteria from the gut have translocated to the breasts and caused breast cancer. We've seen some of these, and there's also a study where bacteria translocated from the gut to the liver, and a similar thing. So we've seen that bacteria is able to move around. Mechanistically, how that happens, I'm not so sure. And I think that's still a big question more broadly. But also the bacteria in the gut, the metabolites that it produces, as I mentioned before with the atopic dermatitis example, is that systemic inflammation and those pro-inflammatory cytokines that those metabolites induce have a systemic effect on the skin. So the skin is then reacting, the skin is changing, you get more inflammation, you get different hormones that are produced, different cytokines, and your microbiome says, oh, this is a different environment, or this is a good environment, we can thrive here. And so that can actually change the balance of what is living on your skin and what is able to sequester nutrients from your skin as well. So there are lots of ways we can change the microbiome. Whether or not they have long-term effects is a whole different question. And I think because this field is in such its infancy at the moment, we don't really have those answers yet. But things like applying topical probiotics, things like microbiome transplantation, different sorts of creams, phototherapies, etc., can all change the microbiome. But I think the one thing that this particular figure is really missing is the impact of nature. So the soil microbiome, and there's been some amazing talks in this space already, but just as a very quick rehash, the soil microbiome is one of the most diverse, incredibly rich substances on Earth. So in 1 gram of soil, you have about, I think, 10 billion microbes in there, which is just incredible. And it's unsurprisingly then that people who live in rural environments actually have a much higher abundance of these particular soil species on Earth. And these microbes have such a great contribution to the wider ecosystem, breaking down, for example, in the forest, breaking down leaf litter, and then being able to sequester those nutrients. The metabolites they produce can then go and help the plants grow and produce nutrient-rich vegetation. So we know that the soil microbiome has a really important impact in the broader ecosystem. And we also know that having exposure ourselves to natural environments and soil is really important for developing a resilient and diverse skin microbiome, and diversity there being the key. So I was a little bit hesitant about this title, about letting kids roll in dirt. And I will get to that why that is a little bit later. So soil is amazing. Having diverse, rich, life teeming soil is absolutely incredible. Not all soil is the same. I will talk about that soon. But this particular study really, I think, encapsulated nicely the value of biodiversity and how critical it is for early life care. So this was a Finnish study. This Professor Felice Jacka mentioned this one last night as well, whereby these researchers set up a daycare playground with a biodiverse environment. So they put in lots of vegetation, lots of organic soil. They had nature-based play equipment, things like that, to make it a really, I guess, very ecological setting for the kids to go and play in. Then they compared the microbiome of those kids to the microbiome of kids who were at a standard daycare center, so without all of that organic soil and diverse vegetation, etc. And they took samples, many different sample types, over a number of time points. So it was skin, stool, saliva, and blood. And they took the samples from all of the kids before any intervention was introduced. And so that was the baseline level. Then they took the sample 28 days later from both cohorts, then 1 year later, and then 2 years later, to see if there was a longitudinal effect on having this nature-based play area compared to having a conventional daycare setting. And they did find that there was a significant increase in overall skin microbiome and all microbiome aspects of those kids who were exposed to the nature-based daycare. And I think that really, really highlights how incredibly important it is to get out in the dirt, to get out in nature and the environment, because the species that they have enriched on their skin and in their saliva were really health promoting species. And we found them, what they found was a long-term colonization of some of these species as well. And not only that, but in one of the later time points, so at about year 1, 12 months after these kids had been regularly in these daycare centers, there was actually a much higher abundance of pathogenic species in the standard daycare rather than the daycare who had the nature-based intervention. So I think it just, again, really highlights the importance of getting out in nature, exposing yourself to these healthy soil communities to increase your skin diversity and to help your immune system be more robust and resilient. And then that sort of begs the question I asked myself, well, is there a real difference between urban and rural skin microbiome? And what was found was, and again, there haven't been many papers on this just yet, because I think it's still something that is quite developing, but it's been found that it had a really big impact, the environment that the kids were in, from birth to age 4. And then the microbiome starts to stabilize and mature after that. So it has a really critical exposure period in that early window when your microbiome is still very malleable. And then as you get older, it tends to differ less between urban and rural environments in terms of diversity, but the species that colonize those particular areas are still different. And there's a lot more research needed into this as to what sort of species these are and the overall broader impact on health. And we've only really relatively recently have the technology to do stuff like that through shotgun metagenomics. But yeah, lots of exciting things I'm sure to come in that space as well. And I mentioned about early exposure and that critical window from when kids are born to about when they're 4 years old. And the reason is because they don't have, when you're born, you're in a sterile environment in the womb. And your microbiome is really seeded from your birthing method. So if that is a cesarean, emergency cesarean, or a vaginal birth, will differ as to what microbes you pick up in that early life. So having a broad exposure to all different sorts of environments can be a really positive thing. And I will add a caveat saying, I am not saying to put your children in a pile of dirt, particularly at birth. But what I am saying is that you can go for a walk in nature. You can, push the pram around a park, or just go out and be in the sunshine, because it does have an effect, just being in a green space, on your skin microbiome and just on your overall health as well. But of course, birthing method is not the only thing that determines what microbes you pick up as a small child. Things like if you've had antibiotics, what method you're fed by, so breastfeeding, formula feeding, or a mixture, different medical conditions, your genetics, your diet, etc., can all impact both your gut microbiome and your skin microbiome as well. And there was this study that was done a couple of years ago in the US that looked at exposure of kids living in farm families versus kids who were not really exposed to farms. And it was a cohort of about 111 kids in the farm family, 130 kids in the non-farming family. And they found that the non-farming family from ages 0 to 2 years old had a higher incidence and accumulation of inflammatory diseases like atopic dermatitis compared to kids who were exposed to lots of different species of animals on a farm who had a lot less inflammatory diseases and didn't have atopic dermatitis and things like that, which sort of shows how having that biodiversity and that exposure to many different environments is beneficial. And again, there is a caveat to this, because it also depends on the method of agriculture, which I will talk about shortly. But not everyone has access to a farm. Not everyone has access to going for a walk in the forest because our society is so highly urbanized now. So if we're not able to get our hands in the dirt, what can we do instead? And there was a Finnish group, another Finnish group, who did a similar study to the daycare, but in an office setting. And instead of having beautiful nature-based playground equipment, they put a green wall in the office. So there were 2 cities that they had sites on, and both of the city offices had green walls in them, and then they had offices without green walls in them. They got workers to take a series of skin and blood tests. So there was before the green walls were installed, there was 14 days after, once they'd been exposed to the green wall for 14 days, and then they did another skin and blood test 2 weeks after they'd stopped the intervention. And what was actually found was that those who were in those green wall offices had much higher levels of health promoting species. And they also had a decrease in pro-inflammatory markers. And I think this is really interesting because it's not people having direct contact with dirt. It's not people going out and digging in their garden or kids rolling around in the mud. This is just simply being in a proximity to the green space. And the authors of this paper did say that they hadn't looked into the mechanistic side of things. They hadn't looked how are they actually having their skin microbiome change? Because we do know that there is that gut-brain axis and mental health effects of being in a green space. So that is still yet to be studied. But I think it's just so incredibly stark how having the environment around you, even inside and not necessarily touching it, has such an incredibly powerful impact on the abundance of species we have, and also decreasing those inflammation markers. And I mentioned about some soils not necessarily being good soils. We increasingly, with urbanization and with different methods of farming or mining or some of those other primary industries, we do see a lot more contamination of the soils, whether that's a mining quarry and heavy metals and fracking and things like that. This is not the type of soil we want to be exposing ourselves to, and it can be harmful. So when we are looking for that soil exposure for skin biodiversity, we do need to be careful. We need to make sure we know where we are. If that's going for a bushwalk, etc., that is absolutely fantastic. But yeah, I would advise. I have a toddler who would love to jump in these puddles, so we have to be really careful of where we are having these exposures to make sure we are actually having our exposure to a highly biodiverse soil that is rich and teeming with life, not these what I would very, very crudely call dead soils, which aren't really doing much there and have been heavily polluted by humans and whatnot. But there are also amazing soils. Soils that support life, soils that are able to nourish us from the ground up, essentially. And this is particularly the case for regenerative farming. So again, there are people who are a lot more qualified to talk about regenerative farming than myself. I'm very much a student in this space and someone who's actively learning to implement these principles on my own farm. But more broadly, regenerative farming is a philosophy of minimizing disturbance to the soil. So that is through things like not tilling the soil. The way I think about this is tilling the soil is like ripping off a doona cover when you're curled up in the morning in winter and you just want to quickly jump out of bed and escape. So when we open up the soil microbiome, the soil like that, the microbes are, if they're an anaerobe, for example, they're exposed to an aerobic environment, they're not going to be able to flourish and proliferate. So we like to minimize disturbance, do things like planting cover crops. So this helps, again, minimizing erosion, sequestering carbon. It helps put some of these nutrients that may have been lost back into the soil, and also minimizes disease as well, and particularly when we have a lot of biodiversity. So if we plant lots of different types of plants together, we do things like rotational grazing, where for example, cattle, we've got ducks. So our ducks will come and eat the pests off our plants. They will poop, which puts nitrogen into the soil. And it's a nice cycle there. And rotational grazing is also really important because we don't want the animals to pull the roots out of the plants, because that then can erode, compact the soil. We want it to be nice and aerated, so short periods over lots of patches is great. And also not having those pesticides and herbicides as well, because your system should work in that you've got those species there that can help with the pests and pest management. And I really wanted to highlight how, when regenerative farming is done well, it can have a huge impact, not only on the health of the soil, health of humans, but also on profitability. So this particular study was conducted, and it was comparing some almond farms in Carolina in the US. So there were 16 farms in total. 8 of those were regenerative farms, 8 of those were conventional agriculture farms. And these samples were collected in 2018 and 2019, so over 2 years. And this was an extremely extensive study. So they did all sorts of different mapping of soil health and microbiome health, looking at the overall biodiversity. And then they also looked at yield and profit. So what they ended up finding was there was actually a significantly higher microbial biomass in the regenerative soil. Along a similar line, there was just generally a much, much higher biomass. So that's not only the microbes, but it's also the insects. It's also fungi, all of those sorts of things. It was much denser, I suppose, soil. So you're seeing mass of 6 grams per meter squared compared to 1 gram per meter squared, which is just absolutely wild. And you also had nearly double the diversity within that soil as well. And they also, I couldn't fit it in this slide, but they also compared the overall yield, and there was no significant difference between the yield of the regenerative farms versus the conventional farms. And in saying that, there was nearly double the profit. And the profit was calculated on a dollars per hectare basis. And they didn't count any byproducts from almond farming. So they didn't count things like selling nut butters or, roasted products or anything like that. It was just the raw almonds, so that it was a true comparative analysis. And they found it to be much more profitable as well. And I'm sure that's a lot to do with not spending money on things like your pesticides and herbicides and big spraying apparatus, for example. So I think seeing this real world example of where it's working on a macro scale with big producers is really promising that something like this could be integrated more broadly, and something that's so impactful for the ecological health, which then has those flow-on effects to improving human health as well. But how does regenerative farming influence the skin microbiome? We don't really know yet. So Felice alluded to it last night. She mentioned that there'll be some work going on at Food and Mood Centre with respect to this. The work that the Food and Mood Centre are doing more broadly in the gut microbiome and nutritional psychiatry space is absolutely incredible. And I'm really, really excited to see some uptake in the skin microbiome and more people getting excited about it, and how this can really influence our health and well-being in a broader setting, and being able to utilize those regenerative farming techniques to really improve overall human health, and also the environmental health as well. So I will leave you with this, which is some practical tips and tricks if you're wanting to, if you're in a highly urban space and you're thinking, oh, I would love to be able to increase my skin microbiome or the diversity or my skin health. What I would say to you is get out in green spaces, whether that's going to your local botanic garden, going for a bushwalk. If you have the space to have a garden, get out in the garden. If not, something like a community garden is fantastic, or even, growing some herbs on your windowsill. So you can bring those plants inside, as we saw in that previous study, that having that interaction with the green environment, the green wall, just having plants inside does have an impact on your overall health. Things like composting, to produce your own soil, buying sustainably produced fruit and vegetables, particularly those that come from regenerative farms that are higher in microbial biomass. These are all things you can do. And I've put get a pet here as well. So for anyone, if you're trying to convince either yourself or a loved one in your life that you need a pet, I would recommend it for your microbiome, especially for kids. It's good for allergy prevention as they get older. So this is my daughter trying to convince us to buy a horse, and our dog here as well. So I hope that you've found that helpful. I hope that it was a little bit educational, and that you've learned something about the skin microbiome and just how important it is for our overall health and well-being. So thank you.
Thank you, Jacoba. That was awesome. Do we have any questions? Please put them in the chat and then I will relay them to Jacoba. I've been wondering, so since obviously I moved from the UK 2 years ago, I hardly ever used to put sunblock on or sun cream. So I'm wondering, do you know anything about that, how that affects the skin microbiome? I assume it might even have a beneficial effect because it prevents UV, UV exposure, but be
Yes.
interesting to know.
I am actually about to publish a study on this.
Ah, perfect.
My previous supervisors are kicking me and telling me to hurry up because it's been a few years. Um, but yeah, so the sunscreen definitely does have an impact on the skin microbiome.
Yeah.
Um, the impact is variable though. So the sunscreen is obviously fantastic for blocking UV radiation, which is great because it helps preserve the barrier integrity of our skin. Really important in that context as well. But sometimes
Mm.
sunscreens also have things like preservatives, antifungal things, some
Yeah.
antibacterial. That can be not so good. I think it's important to it's so important to wear sunscreen from a skin cancer perspective. But yeah, it's just important to have a bit of a look at what's in there.
Yeah, okay. So some of the kind of mineralized ones I assume would interact with the microbes more.
Yeah, yeah. And some microbes can sequester nutrients and things like that. So yeah, it's yeah. It does have a role, but not as big of a role as, say, some fragrances or different cosmetics. And yeah, super important. As a skin cancer researcher, always wear sunscreen.
Yeah, thanks for that. Interesting stuff. Any more questions? Please put them in the chat.
Well, I can see.
There's been a bit of chatter about whether there are differences between conventional or organic farms, but yeah.
Yes. Yeah, as Jake mentioned, I'm really hoping that we start to see some studies over the next few years looking at this because it'll be such a beautiful case study of how biodiversity is intricately linked to not only the skin microbiome, but also the gut microbiome, and really reinforcing that gut-skin axis and the gut-brain axis as well. And I think hopefully we'll see a reduction in things like allergic diseases and stuff like that from a very long-term perspective of being able to implement more of these sorts of farms.
Nice. Are there any specific microorganisms in the soil that have already been identified as health promoting species? Are there also studies on airborne environmental microorganisms that colonize the skin?
Yes, so I won't be able to name all of the species, but one of the ones that they did find in the soil that was also transient on the skin microbiome in that Finnish childcare study was the gamma proteobacteria, which has a lot of health promoting anti-inflammatory effects. There are lots of different species in the soil that do a similar thing by different mechanistic actions. And the cool thing about the soil is that that is a place where researchers looking for new antimicrobials will go and do a deep dive to see, do we have any microorganisms that do produce really strong antimicrobial peptides? So the soil microbiome is a wealth of, I would say, unexplored opportunities waiting to happen. We just need to get there. So yeah, there are definitely lots of health promoting species in there. In terms of airborne microorganisms, Jake, you're a bit more of an expert on this, the aerobiome space more broadly, but I would say from the study that the green wall study, I would say that sort of indicates that just having nature around you might have more of that airborne effect. I definitely think it could impact.
Yeah, that's a good point. So I think that, like Jacob says, that there needs to be more studies on colonization by environmental microbes, but definitely having kind of more biodiversity around you feeds the air with diverse species that you're exposed to all the time. Is QT bacterium, what a cool name, is that like a human specific microorganism, or does it occur in other species, or does it occur in the environment?
We have found Cutibacterium acne in cats and dogs as well.
Yeah, okay.
Um, I'm still not in touch. So I published a paper on this a couple of years ago, swabbing cats and dogs and humans, sort of looking at being in close quarters and seeing what sort of long-term microbiome effects could have. And we did find that there was Cutibacterium acnes on pets as well. Whether or not that's just from rubbing on us all the time and being around the human environment, that's another story.
Yeah.
But it is one of our dominant colonizers.
Hmm. Cool, good to know. One of the earlier slides there was mention of Staphylococcus. Are instances of skin infections like staph infections caused by an imbalance or of the ones that are already there? So aren't something like 40% of people already have Staphylococcus aureus on them anyway?
That's exactly it. Yeah.
Yeah.
So yeah, this is a great question. I would say yes, and I would say that there are a lot of cases where we have opportunistic pathogens on our skin who act as commensals most of the time, but if they have some sort of opportunity, so if you've got an open cut or a wound or something like that, they can pounce, so to speak. And yeah, friends turn foes, exactly that. So yeah, it causes microbial dysbiosis. So Staphylococcus epidermidis, for example, which is our most common skin colonizer, is also an opportunistic pathogen. And we found that in patients with actinic keratosis, so precancerous lesions, which just essentially looks like a dry, flaky patch on your skin, there was an increased abundance in both Staphylococcus epidermidis and interestingly, also Staphylococcus aureus. So they can change what they're doing if they're able to go in and pounce and colonize that space. Um, yeah.
Good question. Any more for any more? I assume things like the environment and diet and your immune system, etc., all those things shape the likelihood that these kind of species will start proliferating.
Yeah, that's exactly it. Yeah, diet is such a big one, particularly with the gut-skin axis and conditions like acne on your face, for example. It's really interlinked with the gut microbiome and the skin microbiome. We see that we've got that pro-inflammatory environment, and then Cutibacterium acnes will proliferate on the face and then cause the condition. So yeah, it is a lot about what's already there, as well as what we're being exposed to in the broader environment.
Nice. Any more questions? Doesn't look like it. Shall we probably wrap up then?
Absolutely.
A round of applause for Jacoba. Great talk. Thank you very much for joining us. And I'll just drop in the chat as well what's on next week. Thanks, Jacoba.
Beautiful. Thank you so much, everyone.
Thanks a lot.
Great.